third time getting quarantined.
Everybody know why?
How long have you been for this?
And then
Okay.
Guys, I don't quarantine.
I already got quarantined, it's terrible.
Oh, it was. Because so we were already quarantined in like homebound. I thought we were doing. And then I was quarantined in my house. Yeah.
Well, it seems not that bad.
It is bad. Your parents don't pay attention to you in the first place. Yeah. There you're like, what do I do? Well, and the fact is I like staying in my room, but when you're forced to stay somewhere, it gets annoying. I don't even like being home. I really only do my house. Yeah, my boyfriend's house, come on. That's my.
Okay. So, I still am not sure what I want to do about a test or the Kahoot thing or not. I wasn't happy with how well the Kahoot tested what I wanted to know. So at some point we're probably going to have an assessment of some kind, but I'm thinking it's probably just going to be some kind of a take-home test. So, and Emily, can I get you to shut the door for me, please? We've talked about a lot of things so far related to the investigation of death. We've talked about evidence. We've talked about evidence in general, the different types of evidence. We've talked about the autopsy. We've talked about the manner of death. We've talked about the mechanism, the cause of death. We've talked about the finding the time of death. We've talked about the decomposition of the body. The next thing that we kind of need to talk about is the investigation of the crime itself. How do we go about investigating the crime?
Lots of numbers.
What's that?
Lots of numbers, those little yellow numbers.
Oh yeah, yes, lots of little yellow numbers. Yes, okay, and at some point we'll have an activity where we actually kind of walk through that as a group, where we'll see if we can mimic what might happen in an actual crime scene. So we've talked about the nature and importance of physical evidence. It should make sense to you by now that if the forensic investigation is going to succeed, it's going to depend on how thorough the investigation of the evidence is. How do we collect all of the evidence? And especially with how much integrity we collect evidence. Do we mess it up, or do we collect it properly and have the correct chain of custody? Do we put it in the correct container? Do we document it the best way we can? And this is what makes this a science, is because we're using the processes of science to conduct the investigation. Okay? And because of this, the individuals involved need to have a lot of training. Okay? I need to be trained in how to recognize evidence at a crime scene. You wouldn't necessarily think that a blade of grass would be a piece of evidence, but if a blade of grass has a drop of blood on it, it becomes a piece of evidence. How do I recognize evidence at the crime scene? Okay? How do I collect it properly and preserve it? How do I make it so that it doesn't decompose by the time it gets to the laboratory? Okay? I also need to have access to proper equipment. I can't just go out into the crime scene with my bare hands and start collecting evidence, right? I have to have all of the proper equipment to do this with, and I have to know how the evidence will be handled and tested once it's returned to the crime lab. Depending on what they want to do with it, I might collect it one way or I might collect it another way. So I have to have some kind of understanding of how the evidence is going to be tested at the crime lab. And then I have to have a perspective, a mind frame that makes it so that I can consider all of the possibilities for this evidence. I can't just go and immediately form a conclusion about what happened without considering all of the possibilities, right? My mind frame has to allow the direction of evidence collection to cover all of the possibilities. I can't get locked into a situation where I form a conclusion right at the beginning, and so I only collect certain types of evidence. I think it happened this way, so I'm only going to collect this evidence or that evidence. I have to be able to collect all of the evidence without bias as to what caused what course the crime took. So the problem is most jurisdictions don't have access to a crime team or a crime lab. In Salt Lake, we have an amazing medical examiner's office that has a crime team that goes out to the site and collects evidence. But the problem is that the individuals collecting the evidence will have a range of training and experience, okay? And the closer I am to a crime lab, the more likely it is that I'm going to have that training. But in all likelihood, if you want to commit a crime and get away with it, commit the crime in a jurisdiction that's hundreds of miles away from a crime lab, because the likelihood is those individuals don't have the training and the expertise to justify or to justly collect the correct evidence. Okay, so you see these cases all the time. 2020 is a good example of where you'll see these cases, and they'll be in these backwoods areas where people botch the collection of the evidence, right? So if you want to commit a significant crime, go to a very small jurisdiction. So that's all this paragraph tells us, is that the likelihood that you're going to have the capability to adequately process a crime scene is probably going to depend on your distance from a major crime lab. Okay? What's that? What?
Are you teaching us how to commit crimes?
No. Why would I do that?
He's teaching you how to get away with them.
Oh, that's kind of the same thing. Okay, and then a crime scene investigator must also have a mind frame that allows them to consider multiple possibilities. Again, immediate conclusions based on limited initial information are dangerous and lead to collecting only information that supports your limited perspective. If you jump to an immediate conclusion that this must have been what happened, you're only going to collect the information that supports your thoughts, right? And we're all like that in everyday life. When we're talking to someone else and we see something happen, we're only going to remember the things that support our side of the story, right? So this is something that you can't have if you're a crime scene investigator. Okay? So we have a bunch of different roles that we need to consider when we're investigating a crime scene. And there are at least 5 of these that you need to be aware of. And one of the things that you'll see is that, again, on these crime scene shows, or these crime scene investigator shows, CSI shows, it seems like the crime team does everything, right? It seems like they do everything. They go and they process the crime scene, they control the crime scene, they collect all the evidence, then they take it back to the lab, and then they do all the processing of it, and they go ask all the questions of all the people. It doesn't happen that way, okay? It's not necessary that each of these roles be played by separate individuals, only that each of these roles is covered. Now, the problem with that is that the lines of command and who is responsible for what are oftentimes blurred. So you'll oftentimes get these turf wars between the police and the crime team. And in any jurisdiction, it should be very clear who is responsible for what, okay? So regardless of the roles, the investigation of the crime scene is an extremely difficult, labor-intensive process, okay? You can't go into this with the thought that it's so glamorous and it's so sexy and it's all of this all of these wonderful things. It's a lot of hard, detailed work. If you want to do this for a living, you have to commit yourself to the fact that this is really, really hard stuff. So all the personnel have to have the mindset the investigation will only be successful with their full attention and focus. And these days it's hard to accomplish that kind of focus. We've got so many things pulling us in so many different ways. Unless you're an extremely focused individual, you're not going to be successful in this kind of a career, okay? So the roles that we're going to talk about come from the website that they come from a lot of different websites, but that's the main one that I've used, okay? So in any situation, there's going to be a team leader, and a lot of times on the crime shows, you'll say, okay, you're taking the lead in this case. DiNozzo, you take the lead, right? And NCIS and NCIS New Orleans are probably my two favorite shows on TV. Anyway, the team leader is the one that assumes the control of the crime scene. And there's so many things going on. I would never be a good crime lead. Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, let's say that there's a serial killer, but the serial killer is, like, placing bodies in different jurisdictions. Who would get, like, the leader position of this?
Okay, so we'll talk about how the lead is determined. In a particular jurisdiction, it's going to depend on how that jurisdiction is set up. But from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, each jurisdiction would have their own lead on that particular investigation. But if you've got, especially if it crosses state lines, the FBI is going to be involved. And so each jurisdiction is going to have their own control over those bodies. But in all likelihood, the FBI is going to kind of be the overseer of all of these things. And we've got it now so that the information that's collected can be shared easily between jurisdictions. But in all likelihood, the FBI is going to be the one that sort of oversees that kind of a situation. But if you have neighboring cities, and there's like two crimes, then one in one city and one in the next, and that's the extent of it, you're right. There's going to be turf wars because they're going to want to. One's going to want to say, well, I want to control this. You hope that they'll say, okay, let's sit down and share and collaborate. But it may not always happen that way. Okay, so this team leader is going to assume control. They don't just direct the activities of the investigation itself. They have to ensure the safety of all of the personnel, and they have to ensure the security at the scene. So we'll find out that the absolute first thing that we consider is, can I even go into the crime scene? If it's still an active crime scene, you can't go into the crime scene. You have to have the crime scene completely shut down and safe before any individuals can do anything. The other thing is that you have to ensure the health of the individuals, the victims, okay? If there are still living victims in the crime scene, the medical needs to be taken care of before you can actually start processing the crime scene. So they have to ensure that the personnel follow all of the recommendations for protective equipment for any health hazards, including blood. There's oftentimes blood or other human body fluids. You have to make sure that your personnel are correctly gowned up. If there are any chemical hazards, you have to be aware of those and make sure that those things are protected as well. The team leader is then going to conduct an initial walkthrough, okay? So they're going to go around the entire scene, and they may take their team with them, or they may just do this themselves. They'll conduct an initial walkthrough for making a preliminary survey, evaluating potential evidence, and beginning a narrative description. Okay? Then they're going to be the one that says, okay, this is the search pattern we're going to use for the evidence, and they're going to assign the individuals that are part of the team to specific jobs. They're going to set up a command post, and they're going to create a liaison between the team and the media and the other investigative personnel. They coordinate with law enforcement agencies. They also have to make sure we've got all of the right supplies, and they have to control access to the scene, right down to making sure that every individual that comes into the scene is documented. Everyone that leaves the scene is documented. And then they're also going to have to constantly be looking, is this working? Is this working? Is this working? This isn't working. I need to change the course of what we're doing here. And then they have to release the scene after a final survey. And there's so much stuff here, it just kind of boggles your mind. It's like, man, I know I could never be the person that leads a crime team. There's too many things to worry about and consider. I'm not that kind of a person. I can't do that. So if you are that kind of a leader, that kind of a person, then you'll do well in something like this. So the team leader, and usually those decisions are made before you even go to the crime scene, right? A lot of that stuff is already dealt with, and you know what's going to happen once you get to the crime scene. Photographer, one or more photographers are going to have to be present, so that's another role that's present. So the team leader, and then there's a main photographer, and this is the scope of what they do. They've got to photograph the entire area, the victims, the crowd, the vehicles around, the entire scene with different types of pictures, large view, medium, and close-up. Photograph major evidence before it's moved. Photograph all fingerprints and other impression evidence before lifting or casting. What's impression evidence? What do you think impression means here?
Impressions on the skin and the environment.
What's that?
Some impressions on like if it was a killing, like the skin or the environment.
So not exactly. Impression here is a literal impression. So if I have a handprint in the ground, that's an impression. A fingerprint is an impression. And was that what you meant, or?
Yeah, like footprints.
Okay. I wasn't sure I understood you. And I'm running into problems here. My ears are really plugged, and you know, since I can't see you guys' mouths when you talk, it's hard for me to always necessarily hear exactly what you're saying. So I apologize if I keep asking for you to say things. But yeah, any kind of an impression. If there's wax, you know, some kind of an impression's made in wax or soft concrete or something like that. And then they've got to log and document all of this. And despite the fact that we have somebody with that's taking pictures of everything, we also need to have somebody that sketches the scene out, okay? So they're going to create a sketch, and we'll look at what one of those sketches looks like. So we have to have a sketch preparer. Then we have to have somebody that's recording the evidence and keeping the evidence as it's collected, okay? I have to have a person that documents this piece of evidence came from this place, okay? And like Blair says, we've got all those yellow numbers. And so those are the things that mark where different pieces of evidence are. And you have to have somebody that goes around and says, okay, we got this piece of evidence from number 1, we got this piece of evidence from number 2, and so on. Okay? And they have to describe that evidence and its location, and they have to make sure it's bagged appropriately. If it needs to go in a paper bag, it goes in a paper bag. If it needs to go in a plastic container, it goes in a plastic container. If it needs to be in a special type of container that maintains biologic integrity, it has to go in that container. So that's that person's responsibility. And then we will oftentimes have specialists for certain types of things. And so the crime lab is responsible for determining whether that specialist is reliable, whether or not they have the ability to work at a scene within law enforcement guidelines, and they have to make sure that their specialist is good in presenting expert testimony in court. That's another thing that I would have a really difficult time with. When I worked with the medical examiner during my training, I got to see them in court a couple of times, and these guys were cool as cucumbers, man. They knew how to say things without saying too much or without saying too little, and they didn't get flustered. The first thing that I would do if I got on the stand is I'd just get all flustered and I wouldn't be able to talk. So specialists should be identified before they're needed in an actual case. The agency should meet with these to determine the best manner to conduct their operations, but things that you might want to also bring into the mix are anthropologists, blood pattern analysts, bomb technicians, all of this list here, an entomologist. We talked about bugs. Obviously, the medical examiner is going to be something that's present for all of these things. The pathologist doesn't always go to the scene. Okay, so those are the main players. Okay, these are the main players that we have, and most of the things that you see on crime shows, or most of the things that you'll see related to investigations, will fit into one of those things. You've got a team leader, you've got a photographer, you've got a sketch person, you've got people that are collecting the evidence, and it may be more than one person that's doing it. A lot of times they'll have a huge team where they'll have 3 or 4 people working on that same goal. Okay. So once we get all of our group together and we know who's going to be doing what, we then get to the point of working the actual crime scene. And no crime scene investigation should go so rigidly by a set pattern that it limits their ability to think outside the box. Okay, you've got to have the ability to do things in a specific way, but you also have to have the creativity on board to be able to learn to know when to sort of break protocol a little bit, or how it's acceptable to break protocol. And a lot of this depends on experience, okay? So you can be the most intelligent crime scene person right out of school, but you don't have a lot of experience at that point, and you are going to miss things that more experienced people won't, even if they're not as intelligent as you are. So the overall concern has to be preserve the crime scene and its evidence as much as possible, and in the state that it existed during the time of commission of the crime. Otherwise, you're going to lose information, you're going to mislead investigators, and you're going to have problems if you don't. Okay, so this is a pretty long list of things, and we're not going to touch on everything, and I'm not going to sit here and read all of this to you. But this is more of a, just like the autopsy thing is, it's more of a resource for you to have. But we'll touch on some things here that as we kind of go through this in a more brief type of way. As far as preparation goes, if there's time, there's not always time for this, but if there's time, you want to know everything you can about the case before you actually go to the crime scene. And it may be that the team leader, you have different leaders, right? You may say, okay, in this case, you take the lead. In this case, you take the lead. Each person might have some individual things that they're better at and will make them a better leader for a particular situation. So a good crime team is going to be able to look at the basic information about it and say, okay, this leader is going to do the best in this situation. But you've got to take care of things like any kind of legal issues related to searching a place. Issues regarding search warrants need to be resolved. Adverse conditions need to be identified, especially weather conditions, whether or not the scene's still active. All these kinds of things need to sort of be decided in advance or at least talked about in advance. And everyone that's going to need to be involved should be made aware that, hey, we've got this investigation that's going to be going on. I need you to be on call to make sure that you can come to the place if you need to. Okay, so, and I've provided a lot of detail for each of these steps here. Again, I'm not going to expect you to know all of these tiny details. That would be crazy. That would be more like an actual course in your preparation for this kind of a career. This is just kind of an introduction to this. But the first thing that you're going to do is when you get to the scene, if you're the investigator, there's probably already going to be somebody there, right? Somebody else has figured out that something's happened. And there's a scene, something's taken place, and there are going to be police there probably already. But the crime scene investigator, if you have someone from a crime lab or a crime team, that person will come up to the individuals that are already there and say, I'm so-and-so, I'm taking over this operation, okay? Not in a mean way, but the cops should already know that this person has the authority to take that over. And they're going to make sure then once you come to this crime scene, the lead is going to make sure that the scene, the whole scene, and it may be a large scene, they're going to make sure that it's secure, so they're going to call for backup if more backup is necessary to secure the crime scene. If there's a large crowd present, you've got to make sure that the crowd doesn't become involved, and you've got to, at all costs, take steps to protect your evidence. Okay, so above everything else, once you know that you can start investigating, you protect the scene from other people, and at that instant that you get on the site, you don't let anybody in or out of the site without your knowledge. Okay? So securing the crime scene is that first step. Then you're going to do your preliminary survey. You're going to go through your walkthrough, and you're going to identify in this walkthrough what needs to be looked at first, what needs to be looked at second, what needs to be looked at third, and you're going to make sure that your boundaries are set, usually with crime scene tape, right? And then you're going to evaluate the physical evidence possibilities. Once you do your walkthrough, you should have some idea of the types of evidence that you're going to expect to find. Now, we said before, we don't want to get locked into a set way of thinking before you miss evidence. You want to make sure that you consider all the possibilities, but this is the point where you say, okay, I think we're going to find this type of information, this type of information, this type of information, and this type of information. We need to focus on finding those kinds of things. Okay, so we secure the crime scene, we do our walkthrough and figure out what the boundaries are. Then we say, we're going to find this kind of information, and then you start creating a narrative description. And usually that's going to be a tape recording. It used to be that they wrote everything down, but we're better than that now. So it's going to be a tape recording or even a video at this point, where you start this narrative description of how you're going through the crime scene. Okay? And a lot of these things are going to actually start to happen all at the same time. So a lot of these things in the middle are going to be going on at the same time. You've got to make sure you have your photographer focusing on the things they need to focus on. You need to prepare a diagram of the scene, and that's your sketch person. And then when you've got all of this stuff figured out, then you start to conduct your detailed search. And that's where you decide, okay, we're going to follow this kind of a search pattern. We record and collect all the physical evidence, we conduct our final survey, and then we release the crime scene. Okay? So, again, that seems like an extraordinary amount of stuff to be responsible for. And like I said, we're going to try and do some of this in a mock way. If I can get that figured out, we're going to try to practice this a little bit at some point. So how do we approach and secure and protect the scene? Okay, so like I said, you're probably not going to be the first law enforcement official on the scene, and they're going to be the ones that establish the scene. So depending on how much experience they have, they may or may not have done a good job of that by the time you get there. But if you're in an area where there's a crime lab, most of the law enforcement people in that area probably know how to establish a scene and start to protect the scene once they come upon it. So the first priority is to make sure medical assistance is given to people who are there, and it's not still an active scene. If it's still an active scene, you can't do anything. So if any of the perpetrators are remaining at the scene, they have to deal with that first. You don't want your crime team getting killed. But as soon as possible, we need to limit access to the scene, and we're going to use additional people, barricades, crime tape, etc., to accomplish that. And the lead investigator, again, will come along and take charge of the scene, and they're going to establish the boundaries of the crime scene, note any possible approaches and exits to the crime scene, and note and document any obvious items of crime scene evidence at that point. So then they're going to take control of the scene, determine what's happened so far, ensure adequate security, obtain knowledge from personnel that have entered the scene, and they're going to start now making a log of who's in the scene and who enters and who leaves it. Okay, so that's the initial approach to all of this, approaching and securing the protecting the scene. That's what this involves. Okay. Once you establish the scene, there's going to be an initial walkthrough, and I'm not going to read through all of these steps here, but the point of this initial walkthrough is to say, okay, we will find this type of evidence here, we'll find this type of evidence here, we'll find this type of evidence here, and I need you to focus on this, I need you to focus on that, and the preliminary photographs are going to start to be taken, and you're going to start to develop a theory of how the crime developed, okay? You're also going to start to say, okay, we're going to need this kind of equipment for this evidence, we're going to need this kind of equipment for that evidence, and you're going to start to document everything that you're doing. So that initial approach that initial approach, that initial walkthrough, the goal of that is to say, I need these assignments to be taken care of. Okay, I need these assignments to be taken care of, and here's how we're going to accomplish that. So, based on what is known from the survey, what evidence is likely to be present, and the thing that you're going to do is you're going to concentrate on the most transient evidence first. You're going to figure out which areas are the most exposed to the environment. If it's raining, you're going to start setting up tents over the evidence that you want to protect. You don't want blood spatter evidence to be washed away, for example. So things like blood spatter, collection of DNA samples or fingerprints, those kinds of things, you're going to want to try and do first, so that if circumstances happen that those get washed away or destroyed in some way, you've got those taken care of first. So transient forms of evidence are going to get looked at first. You're also going to look in easily accessible areas first, and then progress to possibly out of view locations. There's a lot of times where evidence doesn't get found until later on, when somebody realizes, you know what, I bet somebody could have hidden something in that spot there. Let's go back and find out if we can find more evidence. And a lot of times you'll see where evidence that they collect initially doesn't completely make sense, and they'll say, okay, let's go back and do a more thorough search of this. And you wonder, well, why didn't they do that in the first place? It's not always easy to accomplish, but we would look for purposely hidden items. Also consider whether the evidence appears to have been moved inadvertently or whether it looks like a crime scene has been contrived. Obviously, the narrative is to document what's going on at the crime scene from beginning to end, represent the scene in a general to specific pattern, so describe things more generally first and then hone in on details. So things that you want to include are things that are little details that might be important, but don't allow this to degenerate into an unorganized attempt to recover physical evidence. It's recommended that physical evidence not be collected at this point anyway. So you're going to do this basic narrative of what your thoughts are to begin with, and then you're going to go to more detailed kinds of things. Photographic evidence, in order for it to be, and these are just some general things, in order to ensure that it's admissible, you have to take pictures of it before the things are moved or taken from the site, okay? You can't submit a picture of something like a knife with a blood stain on it out of context. You need to take a picture of the knife in the context that it was taken in for it to be admissible in court. If items are moved before pictures are taken, they should be noted, and the items should not be reintroduced to the scene before taking pictures, okay? One of the things you absolutely can't do is say, oh, I probably shouldn't have moved it, and put it back and then take the picture. You can't do that. And this point here is really important. The great value of photographs is they can show the relationship of all of the objects within the scene related to each other. Care must be taken not to alter photos in any way in order for the photos to be introduced as evidence. Let's see, what do I want to say here? Most of this you can kind of read through on your own. This is just the details. All fingerprints need to be taken pictures of. We'll talk more about photographing fingerprints when we talk about fingerprints. Again, a lot of this is just detail, and we'll touch on a lot of it more specifically later. The sketch, collection of physical evidence. One of the things that you don't see a lot of necessarily is the detail of the search in a television show. A lot of times they'll use specialized search patterns depending on what the location looks like or what the location contains. And we're going to talk a lot more about these details in a minute here. A couple of things to be aware of. The best search options are typically the most difficult and time-consuming. You can't over-document physical evidence. You only have one chance to do this right. So those are things that you keep in mind when you're working this. Once they collect all that information, collecting the physical evidence, they'll do a final survey, and then they'll release the crime scene. There were a couple of points related to the photography that I wanted to point out here. When you're taking pictures, in order for this to be able to be used in court, a couple of things that you have to consider. It obviously has to have relevance to the case. You don't want to take a picture and submit that as evidence in court if it doesn't really have much to do with the case. And the photograph can't be taken to specifically appeal to emotion. Okay? Now, you're aware that you can take pictures in a way that will appeal to emotion. Okay? If you want to appeal to the jury's emotions, you take a picture of the most gruesome thing that you can, right? But that's not going to ever be allowed in court because that appeals to their emotion, okay? You need to take pictures that are as sterile as possible. And a lot of times, they won't allow color pictures to be submitted in court. For example, if you can see all of the color of the blood, they won't allow that because that evokes a lot of emotion. Has to be free of distortion, and it can't misrepresent the scene or the object that it's reproducing. Again, you can't move these pieces of evidence that you're photographing before you take the pictures, or you can't introduce that into a court. The photography is listed as a specific step, but recognize it should be occurring from the time the team approaches the scene throughout the investigation. Okay, we need overview photographs. We need photographs taken during the initial walkthrough where the lead says, okay, you're going to do this, okay, you're going to do that, you're going to do this. So the next set of photographs document the individual parts that we've defined during the walkthrough, and then we go to detail, we photograph all of the pieces of information, evidence. Let's see. So as the walkthrough occurs, photos should document every step of the process. As evidence is collected, all items of evidence should have at least 2 pictures, a mid-range shot to show how the item is related to the surroundings, and a close-up to show the details. Okay. Make sure pictures of bodies are taken from multiple angles, and there are close-ups of all visible wounds. Okay. And when we talk about different types of evidence like fingerprints and blood stains and spatter and tool marks and things like that, we'll talk about the way that those should be photographed specifically. This is an example of a sketch. Okay. And it doesn't have to be a masterpiece, okay? All it is just an overview, and you're going to make measurements of the crime scene and document those on the sketch, and you're going to show where pieces of evidence are. So these little flags, again, as Beckham suggested, are where we found specific evidence, and you want to document where evidence is in relationship to specific pieces of furniture. Obviously, the photographs will show all of the same information as well, but this is a good overview. So if you're discussing the case with your collaborators, you can talk about this general overview more readily than you can look at specific photographs, right? The photographs aren't going to show this whole thing here. So you want this sketch to be available to you as well, so you can converse about the case in some detail. So I just wanted to show you that example of a sketch. And we're not going to talk about the details of physical evidence at this point. We're going to just kind of describe what types of physical evidence we need to collect. I don't know why. So occasionally my computer doesn't want to let me navigate. Okay, so we've already talked about physical evidence, and this repeats some of that information. So I'm not going to talk about direct evidence versus class evidence and that kind of thing. But once the crime scene has thoroughly been documented and the locations of evidence noted, then you go back and collect the information, okay? So you don't really start collecting the evidence until you've actually documented where all of it is. And this will usually start with the collection of most fragile or most easily lost evidence. Special consideration can also be given to any evidence that needs to be moved. And we will usually use some kind of a pattern. Grid or linear patterns are most commonly used in open spaces, although a spiral pattern may be more effective if it's particularly large or circular. And you can see the different kinds of patterns that they might use to collect evidence depending on the circumstances. Okay. Most of the items will be collected in paper containers. Liquid items can be transported in a non-breakable leak-proof container. Arson evidence is usually collected in airtight metal cans because evidence could be including volatile chemicals that could be altered if they are in contact with the environment. Moist or wet evidence can be collected in plastic containers, but only if its storage time is going to be 2 hours or less. Under no circumstances should evidence containing moisture be packaged in plastic or paper containers for more than 2 hours, because you're going to start bacteria growing that can destroy the evidence. Any items that can contaminate each other need to be packaged separately. Each type of evidence has a specific value which should be kept in mind by the investigator. But what I wanted to do then is just list the types of evidence that you're going to find. We'll talk about fingerprints. We'll actually do an activity where we'll collect fingerprints. I'm sure you've seen them in the laboratory where they seem to be steaming fingerprints to try to make them come out. We'll do something like that. And it's a pretty cool process. So fingerprints, blood and body fluids. So we'll need to get blood stains or body fluid stains. We'll also need to get blood from the victims directly. And we'll talk about, when we talk about blood and body, how we actually collect it. How do we get it out of carpet? How do we get it out of or off of a tile floor? Things like that. Okay? And there's some detail ready in this, but we're not going to go through that right now. We'll go through that when we talk about blood. Under no circumstances, again, should wet or moist items remain in plastic or paper containers for more than 2 hours. Firearms and bullets and casings found at a crime scene, tool marks. We'll collect all of those kinds of things. Tool marks, for example, a crowbar. If I see an impression of a crowbar on a piece of wood that the crowbar is hit, those kinds of things we need to collect. Let's see. As far as guns go, firearm safety is a must. Firearm must be moved. Never move it by placing a pencil in the barrel or inside the trigger guard. How many times have you seen the investigator take a pencil and pick up the gun with the... You shouldn't do that. It could damage potential evidence. The gun can be picked up by the textured surface on the grips without fear of placing unnecessary fingerprints on the weapon. Before picking up the gun, make sure the barrel isn't pointed at anyone. Keep notes on the weapon. Casings or bullets should be packaged separately and placed in paper envelopes. Knives. Let's see. So again, we'll talk about all of these details when we talk about the specific items. Gunshot residue. If the crime involves a gun, test for gunshot residue. Victim's clothing and the clothing of any suspects available should undergo this testing. Also, gunshot residue collection should occur from around the area of any gunshot wound or from the hands of the accused. Gunshot, let's see, why is GSR in? Oh, there was a controversy about this a couple of years ago. Shoe prints and tire tracks, we can take casts of those. Broken fingernails. Natural fingernails have individualizing striations on them. We can match a broken fingernail to an individual. Documents, bite marks. All of these are information or pieces of evidence that we should collect. Hair, fibers, paint, glass, other types of trace evidence. Okay, so I just wanted to give you kind of a general reference for all of those things. We'll talk about almost all of these things in more detail in their own separate unit, so I'm not going to talk about all these details now. But for a general reference, this document, you should keep this if you don't keep any of your other notes. This is a good general reference for the types of things that are going to happen at a crime scene. So that was long-winded, and I apologize for that. It didn't have any pictures. But we will go back now through a lot of this stuff individually, and that's when I'll show you the pictures and the details of all of that stuff. So, I mean, it's just exhausting talking about all of this stuff because it's so much. And a lot of people go into this kind of a career without realizing how difficult it is. The good news is that most of these individuals are pretty handsomely compensated. You know, most of these individuals will make $70,000 or $80,000 a year. So at this point in time, that's a pretty decent salary. Any questions about any of this stuff right now? Okay. So I apologize for the long-winded discussion without a lot of interaction, but now we'll get to look at each of these things individually in more detail. The first thing we'll probably start looking at is fingerprints. So let's see, today's Tuesday, we have a Thursday, and then a Monday. I don't want to do anything too significant before break. So we might, I'll try to think of some activities that we can do related to this rather than more lecture.
Did everybody else start with one?
No.